Oh, this has a little bit of juice. So problem set number 1 got posted this morning, and it's there for your amusement and pleasure to work on between now and next Tuesday when it will be due in class. So I'll talk more about that on Thursday, so that you have some idea what to do next Tuesday when you come in with your completed problem set. Okay, now this works and the computer's off. What the heck is going on here? Oh, that's better. We had a picture before, didn't we? Okay. I don't know. Okay, so there we go. Technical problems must be all that new Apple hardware that's out there that's causing the problems. So today we want to chat about several things. So an interesting question might be, if the government was to permanently increase its purchases as a share of GDP, what effect would that have on real interest rates? Not nominal, but real interest rates. What effect would that have on investment in the economy? What effect would that have on net exports in the economy? Or as another idea, suppose that business executives became much, much more optimistic about the economy. What effect would that have on the real interest rate, on investment, on net exports? So those are some of the things that we want to look at today and on Thursday. But the driving force in our talks today and Thursday is, how is the real interest rate determined in the long run? In the long run. So on average, over a long period of time, how is it that the real interest rate is determined? So that's what we'll be looking at. In order to answer that question, we need to know a couple of things. One is, where do saving come from? Right? What is our source of saving in the economy? And the other is, where does investment demand come from? So we can think about saving as sort of the supply of loanable funds in the economy, and investment as the demand for loanable funds. So if we think about it that way, then we can maybe come to some idea about how interest rates are determined and how they change under certain circumstances. Well, let's start by talking about saving, where they come from and how they're used. So we have a very, very simple definition of saving. Saving is simply the difference between our current income and our current spending. Right? How much am I earning, what's my income look like, and how much am I spending? Right? That difference then tells us how much is being saved. Now, saving themselves takes place in both the private sector, by households and businesses, and in the government or the public sector. Right? The government can save money as well. We'll talk about how they might do that in just a minute. Now, earlier we've talked about stocks and flows. Remember, a flow is something that takes place over time. Income is something that's generated over time. Spending is something that takes place over time. Consequently, saving is something that takes place over time. So saving is a flow concept. Okay? Now, saving is an annual increment or a time period increment. How much are you saving per year? It's not how much have you saved from the beginning. Right? It's what is taking place during any given time period. It's a flow concept. Now, let's break it down between private saving and government saving. So on a private saving basis, we can say that private saving is simply our disposable income, that is our income after taxes, so real GDP minus real taxes, minus our current consumption, or current spending, in which case we're subtracting out consumer spending. Now, because we're talking about private, we don't have to worry about government purchases. But you might be wondering, well, why don't we have investment in there? And the reason is, remember, investment is primarily in capital goods. Capital goods are things that last for numbers of years, 3, 5, 10, 20, 50 years. That's not what we call current spending. We're only using a little bit of that up every year. So we don't include investment as part of current spending. Okay? So here we are. Private savings equals disposable income. Right? So disposable income is total income measured by GDP minus taxes. So that's our disposable income portion, minus consumption expenditures. We can also calculate the private saving rate. What percentage of our disposable income are we saving? Remember, over long periods of time, disposable income and saving will be growing. So to put it on a more relative basis, we want to calculate that percentage. So fairly straightforward. Just take our saving and divide by our disposable income. Now, government saving, or sometimes called public saving, is how much saving the government undertakes. And here we can think about current income minus current spending. Current income for the government will be its net tax revenues, right? Gross taxes minus transfers. So that's our T. That's how much income the government actually has. And then we need to subtract out its current spending. Now, remember that government purchases can actually be divided into two groups. Government consumption expenditures and government investment expenditures. Right? Government investment expenditures would be things like building roads and highways and airports. Things, again, that, like private investment, are going to last for a long period of time. So to be technically correct, we should not add in government investment expenditures. However, for most countries, government investment is a small share of government purchases. And so, just to keep it simple, we're not going to worry about the breakout between government consumption and government investment. We'll just say that government purchases in total approximate what we're looking at. Right? So we can say government saving is simply equal to net tax revenues minus government purchases. Once again, since government savings will grow over time, the economy will grow over time, to make a comparison across time, we need to think about it in terms of a percentage. So here, we look at government saving as a proportion of real GDP, not disposable income, but GDP. That's all, Ham. Question? Yes? What happened to net factor income and interest payments? Where? Okay, so that's something you can spend, but it's not considered part of your income. Remember, income is earned income, so transfer payments, interest on debt would not be counted as part of that. But it would affect consumption. Now, we can also think about government saving as the government budget balance. So if we have government saving as net tax revenues minus government purchases, T minus G, that of course can have a positive value. Tax revenues could be greater than government purchases, in which case we have a budget surplus or government saving. If, on the other hand, G is greater than T, government purchases exceed net tax revenues, the government then will be running a budget deficit. So government saving would be negative, which is generally referred to as dis-saving, right? Negative saving or dis-saving. So we can think about government saving either in terms of budget surpluses or deficits, or just call it government saving, remembering, of course, that it can be negative as well as positive. Oops. Okay, so now we're back to national saving. In national saving, again, it's just the sum of those two. So here we can see that private saving, we said that private saving was income minus taxes minus consumption, and that government saving was net tax revenues minus government purchases. We want to add those two together. Notice we have a plus taxes and a minus taxes, so those will cancel out, and we're left with national saving is equal to real GDP, or economic activity, minus consumption, minus government purchases. And then we can calculate from that the national saving rate. How much national saving do we have per unit of GDP? And then this shows us a chart of all three of those. The purple line down here at the bottom is the government's net saving as a percent of GDP. One of the things that you can see is that most of the time it's negative. Right? In other words, the government most of the time has a budget deficit. And when we mean the government, we mean in the aggregate. So it's not just the federal government, it's all state and local governments and other types of government entities. So when we aggregate those all up, it has a deficit. So the government has negative saving or dis-saving. So one of the things we might be interested in knowing is, what's the implication of a big drop in government savings like we saw in the aftermath of the Great Recession? What does it mean if we have a budget surplus like we did at the end of the 1990s? Now, the orange line here, which ends up now over here, is our private saving rate. So this isn't on disposable income. This is actually on GDP, because we want to put them all on the same basis here. So in this case, something to notice is that through about the mid-1970s, see if I can get something that looks like the same color, through the 1970s, or up to about early 1980s, private saving was about 7.5 or 8% of GDP, pretty consistently. And then we saw slow deterioration up until the advent of the recession. And then once the recession began, people started to save a bit more. Saving rates went up and then stabilized at a higher, but not a high level. We're only at about 4%. And of course, national saving is the sum of those two, the weighted sum of those two. So you can see again that national saving back in the 1950s and the 1960s through the mid-70s averaged a little over 10%. Then it sort of declined along with private saving, improved a bit in the late 1990s with the improvement of government saving, then fell sharply through the end of the recession, and then has climbed a bit since then. So notice that the national saving rate has a tendency to follow the trend on private saving, but the short-term fluctuations largely reflect what's happening to government saving or dis-saving. Now, that's where our saving comes from, either the private sector or the government sector. What actually happens to the saving, right? So when we think about saving, most of the time we think about, oh, gee, I had income, I had expenditures, I've got a difference, I take my saving, I make a deposit in a bank or some other type of financial institution. So what we also want to know, though, is not where does the saving come from, where do the funds come from, where do they go, right? What happens to this? So we can go back to our national income identity, which is economic output or activity is equal to consumption plus private investment plus government purchases plus net exports, right? That's the equation we developed last week. National saving, as we just saw, is economic output minus consumption minus government purchases. But if this is equal to economic output, we can simply substitute in here. So we can also say that national savings is C plus I plus G plus NX, consumption plus private investment plus government purchases plus net exports minus consumption in minus government purchases. Notice we have a plus consumption and a minus consumption, so they cancel out. We have a plus government purchases and a minus government purchases, so they cancel out. Notice what we're left with. National savings equals investment plus net exports. So there we are. So national saving tells us how much funds have been saved during that time period. The right-hand side, investment, private investment in net exports, tell us how those savings are going to be used. So the saving is going to be used to either fund private investment or a net export surplus. So national saving funds either private investment or a net export surplus. Now we can take this particular equation and move it around a little bit so that we have the difference between national saving and private investment, and that equals net exports. This is something that we refer to as the net capital outflow identity. Now here, where we talk about net capital outflow, the capital that we're talking about are not capital goods. This capital is financial capital. Right? It's funds that are being outflowed. And we'll see how that works in just a minute, and also again on Thursday. Okay? So let's think about the situation where we have a net export surplus. Right? So when when net exports are greater than zero, this is a net export or a trade surplus, sometimes referred to as a current account surplus. Remember, I told you earlier, the reason in economics we have multiple expressions for essentially the same concept is so that we can confuse non-economists. So try that on your roommates. Okay? So there are some small technical differences between these three, none of which we need to be concerned about. Now, when we have a current account surplus, then it will also be true that saving minus investment will be positive, or that saving will be greater than investment. So let's think about national saving of, say, $1 trillion and domestic investment of $800 billion. So remember, people like you and me in businesses have saved $1 trillion. We've put them into primarily banks, easiest way to think about it. And the banks have lent out $800 billion to private businesses. What about the other $200 billion? Where does it go? Well, if the interest rate can't change, that bank that has that, or the banks that have that extra $200 billion have one of two choices. They can do nothing with it except keep it on deposit, at which point their rate of return will be zero. Or they can lend it out, not to domestic businesses, but rather to foreigners. Right? Ship the funds abroad. I've got more savings than demand for loans in the home country, so the difference then will get sent abroad. That means we would have to have a net capital outflow. Again, this is financial capital that we're talking about. Okay? So financial capital will be flowing out of the country whenever we have saving that is greater than domestic investment. But when that capital is flowing out, you're buying something at the other end. Generally, not always, but generally speaking, a financial asset, a bond, a stock, or something of that nature. Now, these are foreign bonds and foreign stocks. So when you send funds abroad to buy, say, a foreign bond, you've actually lent the issuer funds. So net capital outflow is also the same thing as net foreign lending. We've lent the money out to a foreigner. The financial capital has flowed out of the country. But when you lend somebody money and they promise to pay you back, you've also made an investment, a financial investment. So net capital outflows are also referred to as net foreign investments. Right? Three different expressions for the same concept. Right? So now you can really confuse your roommates. Okay, so this is what happens if we have a current account or net export surplus. What about if we have a net export deficit? That is, NX is less than zero. Again, we would say we have a net export trade or current account deficit. When we have a net export deficit, then saving will be less than investment, or saving minus investment will be less than zero. So here, businesses, domestic and businesses, want to borrow $1 trillion, but domestic savers are only saving $800 billion. Now we've got a $200 billion shortfall, and the only way to meet that is to borrow money from abroad. So financial capital will have to now flow into the country. So we would end up with a net financial capital inflow, or we have done net foreign borrowing. So notice then, the trade balance, net export balance, tells us whether we are lending money to foreigners or borrowing money from foreigners. So let's take an example. Let's think about a country that has a net export surplus. Right? So NX will be positive. China, Germany, Saudi Arabia are all countries that have very large net export surpluses. So let's just think about what it means if you're China and you have a net export surplus. So remember, that means you're selling abroad more goods and services than you're buying from foreigners. But when you're selling abroad, that means that foreigners are buying your exports, but they're paying for them in their own currency. Right? When we go to the store, if we want to buy something that was made in China, made in Germany, made in Saudi Arabia, that'd be gasoline, we still pay for it, but we pay in U.S. dollars. So the exporter, or maybe the manufacturer, sitting back in China, Germany, or Saudi Arabia, is now receiving U.S. dollars. But notice that that business person can't use U.S. dollars.